You don't believe in ancient myths. At least, that's what you tell yourself. You don't worship gods in the sky. You don't fear curses or prophecies. You don't think the universe is run by jealous spirits. And yet, every day, ancient myths quietly shape your fears, your morals, your guilt, even the way you see yourself. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most modern minds are not free. They're running old stories on new hardware. And once you see which myths are still pulling the strings, you can't unsee it. Myths were never just stories. We are taught that myths were simple entertainment. Campfire tales told to pass time in a dark and dangerous world. Primitive attempts to explain thunder, death, and the unknown. That explanation feels comforting because it places myths safely in the past. Something childish, something we outgrew. But that belief itself is a myth. Ancient stories were not designed to amuse people. They were designed to shape them. Myths were tools, psychological tools, social tools. They taught people how to behave when no one was watching and what to fear when they stepped out of line. A myth was never just a story. It was a manual for survival inside a group. Every powerful myth quietly answered the same three questions. Who is in charge? What happens if you disobey? And who deserves punishment? Once those answers were embedded into a story, they no longer felt imposed. They felt natural, obvious, inevitable. That is the genius of myth. It does not command you, it convinces you. The gods inside these stories were not meant to be characters you admired. They were not there for inspiration or wonder. They were authority given a face, fear given a voice, law wrapped in narrative so it could bypass resistance. When lightning struck or famine arrived, the message was never random, it was corrective. Someone had failed, someone had crossed a line. The myth made sure everyone understood that order existed, and that breaking it had consequences. Here's the part most people miss. Those structures never disappeared. When belief systems modernized, the myths did not die. They simply changed their names. What was once divine command became tradition. What was once sacred law became morality. What was once fear of gods became common sense. The story changed, but the psychological wiring remained intact. This is where it becomes dangerous. When control no longer looks like control, it becomes harder to question. When a story no longer calls itself a myth, it stops being examined. It moves into the background of thought, quietly shaping behavior, beliefs, and guilt without ever announcing itself. And once a myth hides inside normality, it becomes far more powerful than any god carved in stone. Fear was the first operating system. Imagine early humans trying to survive in a world that offered no explanations and no mercy. There was no science to soften reality, no medicine to intervene, no safety net to catch anyone who fell. Death came without warning, and often without meaning. Nature was not beautiful or spiritual, it was brutal. And in a world like that, fear was not a weakness, it was the default state of consciousness. But raw fear is unstable. It overwhelms the mind. It paralyzes action. The human brain needed a way to organize terror into something manageable. Fear needed structure. It needed rules. And most of all, it needed a reason. That is where myths entered. A storm was never just weather crashing into land. It was anger, directed, intentional. Disease was not biology unfolding inside the body. It was punishment, a response to something done wrong. Once fear had a face, it became understandable. Once it had intention, it could be negotiated with. You could pray, you could obey, you could submit, and submission felt safer than chaos. This was the first operating system of the human mind. Fear paired with explanation, suffering paired with meaning. Myths did not remove pain, but they made pain feel deserved or avoidable. That illusion of control was powerful. It allowed people to sleep at night believing that survival depended not on randomness, but on compliance. What is unsettling is that this system never shut down. It updated. Today, fear no longer wears the masks of gods or spirits. It wears the face of anxiety. The questions sound different, but the logic is identical. What if I am wrong? What if I disappoint? What if I deserve this suffering? These are not rational assessments. They are echoes of ancient fear seeking justification. The myth did not disappear. It moved inward. The external threat became an internal voice. The storm god became self-judgment. Punishment became guilt. Fear no longer comes from the sky. It comes from within, and because it feels personal, it feels true. That is the final evolution of the myth. When fear no longer needs a story told aloud because the story now tells itself inside your head, the myth of moral surveillance. Ancient myths planted one of the most powerful ideas ever created in the human mind. You are never alone. You are always being watched. By gods in the sky, by ancestors who never sleep. By a cosmic judgment that sees not just what you do, but what you think. This belief shaped behavior more effectively than any army or police force ever could. When the watcher is invisible and eternal, control becomes effortless. You did not need chains. You did not need guards. People learned to police themselves. They learned to feel watched, even in silence, even in private, especially in private. The fear was not of being caught by others, but of being seen by something higher, something that never forgot and never forgave easily. Modern society likes to believe it outgrew this myth, that we replace superstition with reason, that morality now comes from empathy, laws, and shared values. But the truth is more uncomfortable. We did not remove the watcher, we upgraded it. Today the gods have different names: reputation, social standing, public opinion, social media, outrage cycles, screens that never forget, audiences that never fully leave. The judgment is faster now, louder, more permanent, and unlike ancient gods, it comes from other humans who are just as afraid as you are. You no longer need a god watching you from above. You became the watcher. The voice lives inside your head. It comments on your thoughts before you even speak. It warns you before you act. People will judge you. You will be exposed. You are not good enough. This voice does not ask whether something is true or kind. It asks whether it is safe. This is not logic. It is mythic surveillance, adapted to modern life. The same ancient mechanism wearing new clothes. The same fear of punishment, now stripped of ritual and wrapped in psychology. And because it feels internal, it feels like your own voice. That is what makes it so effective. Living under constant moral surveillance is exhausting. It drains creativity. It dulls honesty. It trains you to perform rather than understand. You stop asking what you believe and start asking what will be accepted, what will be rewarded, what will not get you punished. The myth promised order and safety. What it delivered was constant tension, a mind that never fully rests because it is always being watched by itself. Sacrifice never left. Ancient myths demanded sacrifice as the price of survival. Animals were burned, crops were offered, sometimes even people were placed on the altar. The logic behind it was brutally simple. Give up something valuable, and the pain will stop. Give enough, and the gods will turn away. Suffering became a currency. Loss became protection. This idea embedded itself deeply into the human mind. Sacrifice created the illusion of control in a world that felt uncontrollable. If disaster could be prevented by giving something up, then pain was no longer meaningless. It was strategic. It was chosen. And that made it bearable. Now listen closely. That logic never disappeared. We still sacrifice, just not on stone altars. Today the offerings are quieter and far more personal. Time is the first thing we give away. Endless hours spent pleasing, performing, and proving. Then, identity follows. We shrink ourselves. We edit our personalities. We become acceptable versions of who we are. And finally, we sacrifice truth. We bite our tongue. We swallow questions. We silence doubt. Just do not say what you really think. Just play along. Just be grateful. These phrases sound reasonable, responsible, mature, but underneath them lives the same ancient belief. If I suffer quietly, I will be safe. If I give enough of myself away, nothing worse will happen. Pain becomes a bargain we make with fear. Here is the contradiction no myth ever wants you to notice. The more you sacrifice yourself, the less human you become. Curiosity fades, integrity weakens, life becomes performance instead of expression. You survive, but you no longer feel alive. And still, the myth whispers, if you stop sacrificing, something bad will happen. You will lose belonging. You will be punished. You will be exposed. That fear feels urgent, but it is not rational. it is inherited, passed down through stories, rituals, and unspoken rules that taught obedience as safety. Sacrifice once made sense in a brutal world, but when sacrifice becomes automatic, when it is demanded without reflection, it turns from protection into erosion. You are no longer offering something to survive. You are slowly giving yourself away to a story that never learned when to end. Heroes, villains, and the need for simplicity. Ancient myths divided the world into clean, easy categories. Heroes were pure, villains were evil, everyone knew their role and stayed in their lane. The story told you who to admire, who to fear, and who to destroy. There was comfort in that clarity. No ambiguity, no moral tension. You always knew where you stood. Reality does not work like that. Real people are contradictory. Motivations are mixed. Good intentions cause harm. Bad actions sometimes come from fear rather than malice. The real world is messy, unresolved, and uncomfortable, and that is exactly why the human brain resists it. The brain craves simplicity when it feels overwhelmed. It wants shortcuts. It wants certainty. So even in a complex modern world, we keep the ancient myth alive. We redraw the same lines. Us versus them. Good versus bad. Saved versus lost. The language changes, but the structure remains identical. This way of thinking feels comforting because it reduces cognitive strain. You do not have to think deeply if the answer is already chosen. You do not have to listen if the other side is already labeled. You do not have to reflect if you are already on the right team. Certainty feels like safety. But that comfort comes at a cost. Complexity disappears first. Nuance becomes suspicious. Questions start to feel like betrayal. Then empathy collapses. When someone is reduced to a villain, their humanity no longer matters. Their pain becomes irrelevant. Their perspective becomes dangerous. Finally, critical thinking shuts down. The story has already decided who is right and who is wrong. This is the quiet power of the myth. It does not ask you to understand. It asks you to choose a side. And once you choose, the myth rewards you with belonging, validation, and moral confidence. Not because you are correct, but because you are certain. Truth rarely feels certain. It feels provisional, uncomfortable, incomplete. Myths do not tolerate that. They punish doubt and celebrate conviction. And the louder the myth becomes in your mind, the quieter your own thinking grows. Eventually, you stop asking whether something is true. You only ask whether it fits the story. And at that point, the myth is no longer guiding you. It is thinking for you. Identity is the new mythology. Ancient myths did not just explain the world. They explained you. They told people who they were before they ever had the chance to find out for themselves. Chosen or damned. Blessed or cursed. Worthy or corrupt. These labels were not descriptions. They were destinies. Once assigned, they shaped how a person saw their place in the world and what kind of future they believed was possible. Modern society likes to think it escaped that framework, but it did not. It refined it. The gods faded, and labels took their place. Identity became the new mythology. Instead of divine categories, we now use social, moral, and psychological ones. And just like ancient myths, these labels come with rules. They quietly tell you who you are allowed to be, which parts of yourself are acceptable and which must be hidden. They tell you who you are allowed to question and who is untouchable. They tell you what doubts are permitted and which ones make you a threat. None of this is enforced with ritual or scripture. It is enforced with belonging and exclusion. Once identity becomes sacred, thinking becomes dangerous, not because thought is harmful, but because it threatens the story. Questioning an idea no longer feels like intellectual curiosity. It feels like betrayal. Disagreement feels like self-destruction. The myth wraps itself so tightly around your sense of self that separating belief from identity becomes nearly impossible. This is how psychological captivity works. You are not chained by force, you are bound by meaning. You defend the myth because losing it would feel like losing yourself. The fear is not of being wrong. It is of being unmoored. Of having no clear place to stand. Freedom is not choosing the correct identity. Freedom is realizing that you are more than any label could ever capture. Myths want you to be static, definable, and predictable. A thinking human mind is none of those things. When identity becomes mythology, growth feels like danger, and curiosity feels like sin. The branding looks modern and empowering, but the structure is ancient. And just like the myths before it, it promises belonging while quietly demanding obedience in return. Why we still need myths. Here is the part most people miss when they talk about myths. Humans do not cling to them because they are foolish or weak. We cling to them because myths do something real, something necessary. They help the mind survive uncertainty. They soften fear when the world feels overwhelming. They give shape and meaning to chaos when reality offers none. A world without any stories at all would feel unbearable. Pure randomness, endless ambiguity. No frame to understand suffering or loss. Myths step into that void and say this means something. This pain fits into a larger picture. Even if the picture is imagined, the relief it brings is genuine. That is why humans do not abandon myths easily. We do not drop them the moment they are challenged. We defend them, we protect them. Because losing a myth can feel like losing stability. It can feel like standing alone in a universe that does not explain itself. The problem is not myth-making. The human mind will always create stories. That is not a flaw, it is a survival trait. The problem begins when myths are mistaken for truth. When a story stops being a lens and becomes a law. When it can no longer be questioned without punishment. Once a story becomes untouchable, it stops guiding us. Guidance invites reflection. It allows adjustment. Control does not. Control demands loyalty. It demands obedience. It demands that the story remain intact, even when reality changes. That is the moment a helpful myth turns into a prison. Outgrowing a myth does not mean mocking it or tearing it down in anger. It means recognizing its limits, understanding where it helped and where it no longer applies. A child outgrows a map of their hometown not because it was wrong, but because the world became larger. The goal is not to destroy myths. Destruction leaves a vacuum. The goal is to outgrow them, to hold stories lightly instead of clinging to them, to let them inform without letting them rule. A mature mind does not ask which myth is true. It asks which stories still serve understanding and which ones have quietly begun to demand obedience instead. The quiet rebellion. Breaking free from ancient myths does not look dramatic. There are no public confrontations, no grand declarations, no burning of symbols. Real freedom is quieter than that. It happens internally, often without anyone else noticing. It begins with subtle awareness rather than loud resistance. It starts when you notice that some fears do not belong to you. They were inherited, passed down through stories, expectations, and unexamined rules. You feel anxious, but you cannot trace the threat. You feel guilty, but there is no clear wrongdoing. That is not conscience. That is conditioning. Guilt without evidence is one of the strongest tools myths ever created. You also begin to notice when a belief demands obedience instead of understanding, when questions are met with pressure rather than answers, when curiosity is framed as danger. Any idea that cannot tolerate examination is not protecting truth, it is protecting itself. The quiet rebellion is not about replacing one myth with another. It is about slowing down enough to ask different questions. Who benefits if I believe this? Not who claims moral authority, but who gains control. Would this belief still make sense if fear were removed from it? If no punishment were implied, if no exclusion followed doubt? And the most difficult question of all, what happens if I let this story go? That question is terrifying because myths often occupy emotional real estate. They give structure to identity. They explain suffering. Letting go can feel like stepping into emptiness. But emptiness is not the same as meaninglessness. It is space. Space to think, space to choose, space to respond rather than react. This is the real rebellion. Not anger, not rejection. Those still orbit the myth. Clarity breaks orbit entirely. Clarity sees fear without obeying it. It allows belief to be provisional instead of sacred. It replaces inherited answers with lived understanding. A quiet mind is not an obedient mind. It is a free one, and freedom rarely announces itself. It simply stops asking for permission. Ancient myths once helped us survive a terrifying world. But survival is not the same as freedom. Today, the world is different, but many minds are not. We still obey invisible watchers. still sacrifice ourselves to imaginary debts, still confuse fear with truth. The myths didn't vanish, they learned to hide inside us. And the moment you see that, you gain something powerful: choice. The freedom to decide which stories deserve your loyalty and which ones have already expired. If this made you uncomfortable, good. That's the sound of an old myth losing its grip. And if you value truth over comfort, stay curious, keep questioning, and subscribe, not for answers, but for better questions.